The carriage jolted so hard that Alara Whitmore's head struck the window frame, and for one dizzy second she thought the wheel had broken apart on the frozen road. Outside, the driver was shouting at the horses, and the animals screamed back at him, rearing against their harnesses as the wind tore through the bare trees on either side of the lane. Alara pressed her hand to the cold glass and saw nothing but darkness and driving rain, and somewhere far off, a howl that did not sound like any dog she had ever heard. She had left her family home only that morning, but already it felt like a different life. Her father's letter was still folded in her lap, the ink smudged from her own fingers gripping it too tightly during the journey. She did not need to read it again. She had read it so many times that the words had burned themselves into her mind. "You will marry the Duke of Fernhollow. There is no other way to save this family. Do not disgrace us by asking why." She had asked why anyway, of course, though only to herself, in the quiet hours before dawn when sleep would not come. Everyone in the county knew the name Fernhollow, and everyone spoke it the same way, in a hushed voice, as though saying it too loudly might summon something unpleasant. They said the old duke had not been seen in public for over a year. They said his mind had broken sometime after his wife's death, and that his own staff feared him. They said the manor house sat behind a wall of dead trees that no gardener would touch, and that at night, lights moved through its highest windows though no one could say who carried them. Alara had grown up hearing these stories the way other children heard fairy tales, half believing them and half laughing at them over supper. She had never imagined she would one day be riding toward that very house in a storm, sent there like a parcel with her name written on the outside, and no say in what happened once she arrived. The carriage lurched again, and this time it did not right itself so easily. She heard the driver curse, heard the crack of a whip, and then, quite suddenly, the horses found their footing and the carriage rolled forward once more, slower now, as though even the animals sensed they were approaching somewhere they would rather not go. Alara wiped a small circle clear on the fogged window and looked out. The trees had thinned, and in their place rose a black iron gate, taller than any she had ever seen, its bars twisted into shapes that might have been vines or might have been something else entirely. Beyond the gate, half swallowed by mist, stood Fernhollow Manor. It was larger than she had expected and older. Towers rose unevenly from its roofline, as though the house had been built by several different hands across several different centuries, none of them speaking to the others. Most of the windows were dark. A handful glowed faintly, orange and flickering, like candlelight rather than lamps. Somewhere above, she thought she saw movement behind one of the high windows, a shape passing quickly across the light and then gone. She told herself it was only a servant. She told herself that several times. The gate groaned open without anyone visibly touching it, and the carriage passed through into a courtyard where weeds grew thick between the paving stones and a dry fountain stood choked with dead leaves. No lanterns lit the entrance. No footman came running to greet her. For a long moment, nothing happened at all, and Alara sat frozen in her seat, wondering if she had been delivered to an empty house. Then the great front doors opened, and a woman stepped out into the rain. She was perhaps 60 years old, dressed plainly in dark gray, with a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders and a lantern held high in one hand. Her face, when the light caught it, was not unkind, but it was careful, the face of someone who had learned long ago to say only what was necessary and nothing more. "Miss Whitmore," the woman said, as the carriage door was opened for Alara and the rain swept in around her ankles. "You are expected. Come inside quickly, before you catch your death." Alara stepped down onto the wet stone, her traveling case clutched against her chest, and followed the woman up the front steps without another word. The doors closed behind them with a sound like a held breath finally released. Inside, the manor was even stranger than its exterior had promised. The entrance hall stretched upward into shadow, its ceiling lost somewhere above the reach of the candlelight. Portraits lined the walls, but so much dust and grime had settled over them that Alara could make out only pale ovals where faces should have been, staring down at her like ghosts who had forgotten their own features. "I am Mrs. Ashworth," the woman said, setting down her lantern on a table near the door. I keep this house such as it is. You must be tired from the journey. I will show you to your chamber, and there will be food sent up shortly." "Thank you," Alara said, and her voice sounded smaller in this hall than it ever had at home. "I had hoped, that is, I wondered if I might meet the Duke tonight." Something crossed Mrs. Ashworth's face, quick and gone before Alara could name it. "Not tonight," she said. "The Duke keeps his own hours. You will meet him when the time is right and not before." "Is he unwell?" Alara asked, unable to stop herself. "I have heard." "You have heard rumors," Mrs. Ashworth said, not unkindly, but firmly enough that Alara understood the subject was closed. "This is a large house, Miss Whitmore, and old houses breed old stories. I would advise you not to put too much faith in what strangers say about a man they have never met." It was, Alara thought, a strange thing to say, given that she herself had never met him either. But she said nothing more, and allowed herself to be led up a wide staircase whose banister had been carved, long ago, with figures of leaves and birds that the years had worn nearly smooth. They passed along a corridor on the second floor, then through a heavy door into what Mrs. Ashworth called the east wing. Here the air felt colder, and the candles set into the walls burned lower, as though the house itself grew stingier with its light the further one traveled from the main hall. "Your chamber," Mrs. Ashworth said, opening a door at the end of the corridor. The room within was large and handsomely furnished, far more so than Alara had expected. A fire had already been lit in the grate, and a bed with heavy curtains stood against the far wall, beside tall windows that looked out over what must have once been a garden. It was, in its way, beautiful, but something about it made the back of Alara's neck prickle, and she could not say what. "There is one thing I must ask of you," Mrs. Ashworth said, pausing in the doorway. "Once night falls, you are not to leave this room, not for any reason. Do you understand me?" Alara blinked, not for any reason at all. "None," Mrs. Ashworth said. Her voice had lost its warmth entirely now. "The house is not safe after dark for someone who does not know its halls. I will lock the door myself, for your protection, and I will come for you again at first light." "You mean to lock me in," Alara said slowly. "I mean to keep you safe," Mrs. Ashworth corrected, though her eyes did not quite meet Alara's as she said it. "Please, trust me in this, if in nothing else." Before Alara could argue further, the woman had already stepped back into the corridor, and the door shut between them with a heavy, final click. A moment later, Alara heard the unmistakable sound of a key turning in the lock. She stood alone in the flickering firelight, listening to Mrs. Ashworth's footsteps fade away down the corridor, and for a long while she did not move at all. This was not how she had imagined her first night at Fernhollow Manor. She had expected coldness, perhaps. She had expected to be received by a stern old man, half mad with grief, as the rumors claimed. She had not expected to be locked away like something dangerous, or something in danger, in a house that seemed to hold its breath around her. She crossed to the window and looked down at the garden below, overgrown and tangled with vines that had long since swallowed whatever paths once ran through it. The rain had eased to a fine mist now, silver in the moonlight, and for a moment everything was still. Then she saw him. A figure moved along the garden's edge, tall and dark against the pale stone of a low wall, moving with a quick, sure step that belonged to no old man she had ever seen. He wore a long coat that caught the wind, and though the distance and the darkness kept his face hidden from her, something in the way he carried himself made her breath catch in her throat. He paused, as though sensing he was watched, and turned his face up toward the house. Toward her window. Alara stepped back so quickly she nearly stumbled, her heart pounding hard enough that she could hear it in her own ears. When she gathered the courage to look again, a few seconds later the garden below was empty. No figure, no movement, only the mist curling slowly over the dead grass as though nothing had ever been there at all. She told herself she had imagined it. She told herself it several times, the way she had told herself the movement in the tower window was only a servant. But she did not believe herself, not really, and she did not sleep for a long while after that, sitting instead by the dying fire with her traveling case still packed beside her, listening to every creak and groan of the old house settling around her, and wondering exactly who, or what, walked the grounds of Fernhollow Manor after the sun went down. Morning came gray and reluctant, the light seeping through the tall windows as though it too had to force its way past the manor's walls. Alara woke stiff and cold in the chair by the fireplace, her neck aching from the awkward angle at which she had finally fallen asleep sometime before dawn. For a moment she did not remember where she was. Then the memory of the locked door and the figure in the garden returned to her all at once, and she sat up sharply. The door was no longer locked. She discovered this when she rose to test it, half expecting to find herself still a prisoner, and instead found the handle turned freely under her hand. She stepped out into the corridor, uncertain, and found Mrs. Ashworth already waiting there with a tray of bread, tea, and preserved fruit. "You did not sleep well," Mrs. Ashworth observed, taking in Alara's rumpled dress and shadowed eyes. "I saw someone in the garden last night," Alara said, deciding there was no use pretending otherwise. "A man, tall. He moved quickly, nothing like what I had been told to expect of the Duke." Mrs. Ashworth's hands stilled for the briefest moment over the tray before she continued arranging it. "Likely one of the groundskeepers," she said. "We keep a small staff, but they do work at odd hours. The gardens require constant attention, or they would swallow the house whole. At night in the rain. Fernhollow keeps its own schedule, Miss Whitmore, in all things." Mrs. Ashworth handed her the tray with an air of finality. "Eat something. I will show you the house today, what parts of it are open to you, so that you do not find yourself lost." Alara wanted to press further, but something in the older woman's manner told her the questions would go nowhere useful, at least not yet. She took the tray and followed Mrs. Ashworth back into her chamber to eat, and afterward, dressed in fresh clothes from her traveling case, she was led on a tour of the manor that felt less like an invitation and more like the drawing of careful boundaries. The house was enormous, far larger than it had appeared even from the courtyard. Mrs. Ashworth walked her through a long gallery hung with more dust-covered portraits, through a library whose shelves reached higher than Alara could see without craning her neck, through a dining hall large enough to seat 40 guests, though it plainly had not done so in years. Everywhere the same pattern repeated itself. Rooms that had once been grand now sat half in shadow, their finer furnishings shrouded in white cloth, as though the house had been prepared for a long absence rather than actively lived in. "How many people live here?" Alara asked as they passed yet another empty corridor. "Myself, a cook, 2 housemaids, a groundskeeper and his boy, and the Duke, of course." Mrs. Ashworth counted them off almost reluctantly, as though even this simple information cost her something to share. "That seems very few for a house this size." "It is enough," Mrs. Ashworth said, "for a house that receives no visitors." They reached the base of a narrow staircase that spiraled upward into darkness, far narrower and steeper than the grand staircase Alara had climbed the night before. Mrs. Ashworth stopped at its foot and did not move to climb it. "What is up there?" Alara asked. "The West Tower," Mrs. Ashworth said. "It is not part of your tour. The stairs are unsafe, and the rooms above have not been used in years." She said it smoothly, but Alara noticed, or thought she noticed, that the woman's eyes flicked upward for just a moment before she turned away, as though checking that nothing watched them from above. They continued on through a smaller sitting room where, for the first time since her arrival, Alara saw evidence of someone actually living in the house day to day. A chair sat pulled close to the window, angled toward the garden. A book lay open on a side table, face down, as though its reader had only just set it aside. A cup of tea, long gone cold, sat beside it. "Someone was reading here," Alara said, drawn toward the book despite herself. "The Duke sometimes sits in this room," Mrs. Ashworth said, and there was something almost gentle in the way she said it, a small crack in her careful reserve. "He likes the light in the mornings before the rest of the house wakes." Alara looked down at the book. It was a volume of poetry, its spine well worn from use, its pages soft with handling. She had expected, if anything, to find heavy medical texts, or perhaps nothing at all, given the rumors of a man too mad to read. Instead, she found evidence of someone who loved language, who returned to the same pages again and again. "He does not sound mad," she said quietly, more to herself than to Mrs. Ashworth. The housekeeper did not answer at first. When she did, her voice was careful in a new way, as though she were choosing each word with great deliberation. "People say many things about men they have never met, Miss Whitmore. I would ask you to remember that when you finally do meet him." "When will that be?" "Soon," Mrs. Ashworth said. "He asked that you be given time to settle first. He does not wish to frighten you before you have even found your bearings." It struck Alara as a strange kind of kindness from a man supposedly too far gone in madness to care for anyone's comfort but his own, and she found herself turning the thought over for the rest of the day, even as Mrs. Ashworth led her through the remaining rooms open to her, even as the light outside slowly failed, and the shadows in the long corridors grew thick and unfriendly once more. That evening, dinner was brought to her chamber rather than served in the great dining hall, a small meal of roasted fowl and vegetables that Alara ate slowly, listening to every sound the old house made around her. She heard footsteps once, distant and unhurried, somewhere below her window. She heard, later, what might have been a door closing far off in the direction of the West Tower. She thought of the book of poetry left open on its side table, and of the figure in the garden the night before, and could not make the two images sit comfortably together in her mind. A man who read poetry in the soft morning light did not seem like the same man the county whispered about with such fear in their voices. Unless, she thought, sitting very still in the flickering candlelight, they were not describing the same man at all. The idea took root in her mind before she could examine it properly, strange and half-formed. What if the rumors the county told, the mad old duke hidden away in his tower, were not entirely true? What if something else was happening within these walls, something the household staff had been trained carefully to conceal? She thought of Mrs. Ashworth's hesitation at the base of the West Tower stairs. She thought of the way the housekeeper's eyes had flicked upward, checking, as though something might be listening. She thought of the locked door the night before, and the insistence that she never leave her room after dark, not out of cruelty, but seemingly out of genuine concern. Concern for her safety, or concern for someone else's secrecy. When Mrs. Ashworth came to collect her empty dinner tray, Alara could not help but ask, "Mrs. Ashworth, how long has the Duke held his title?" The housekeeper's hands paused on the tray for the second time that day. "Why do you ask?" "Simple curiosity," Alara said, keeping her voice light. "I realized I know almost nothing about him, not even how long he has been Duke of Fernhollow." "Long enough," Mrs. Ashworth said, which was no answer at all, and she gathered the tray and left before Alara could press further, locking the door behind her once again with the same firm, final click as the night before. Alone once more, Alara moved to the window and looked out over the dark garden, half hoping and half dreading that she would see the tall figure again, moving swiftly through the mist. Tonight the garden remained still, empty, giving up none of its secrets. But somewhere in this house, she felt certain now, a truth was being carefully guarded, tended as closely as the overgrown hedges below her window, and she found that instead of fear, what rose in her chest was something closer to determination. She had been sent here without being asked, delivered like a parcel to a man she had never met, expected to marry a stranger the whole county believed to be lost to madness. If there was more to the story than she had been told, she intended to find out what it was, whatever it cost her to learn it. She stayed at the window a long while, watching the mist curl over the dead garden below, and when sleep finally took her, it was not fear that followed her into her dreams, but questions, circling and circling, with no answers yet in sight. Somewhere in the depths of the house, a door opened and closed again, so softly she nearly missed it, and for one brief moment before sleep claimed her fully, she thought she heard, very faintly, the sound of someone climbing the narrow stairs toward the West Tower, one slow step at a time. Earlier that same afternoon, before the light had fully failed, Alara had slipped away from her chamber while Mrs. Ashworth was occupied elsewhere in the house, drawn by simple restlessness toward the garden she had only ever seen from her window. The overgrown paths were easier to walk than they looked from above, and she found herself following a line of broken stone deeper into the tangled green than she had intended, until the manor's high walls rose gray and silent behind her. It was there, crouched beside a dry stone basin pulling weeds with quick, practiced hands, that she found a boy of perhaps 14, dressed in a rough work coat far too large for his thin shoulders. He startled badly when he saw her, nearly dropping the trowel in his hand, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "I did not mean to frighten you," Alara said gently. "I am only walking. You must be the groundskeeper's boy." "Yes, miss," he said, getting quickly to his feet and wiping his hands on his coat. "Wilfred, miss. My father tends the grounds, what's left of them to tend." He glanced nervously toward the house, as though worried someone might be watching from the windows. "You oughtn't be out here alone, if you don't mind my saying." "Not this close to evening." "Why not?" Alara asked, keeping her voice light and unthreatening. "Is there some danger in the garden itself?" Wilfred hesitated, clearly weighing how much he was permitted to say. "It's not the garden, miss. It's only. The house has its rules, and folk who don't follow them don't stay long in service here. I'd rather not lose my place for talking out of turn." "I would never repeat anything you told me," Alara said. "I only wish to understand where I have been sent. Surely that is not so much to ask." Something in her tone seemed to soften him. Or perhaps it was simply that he was young enough not to have fully learned the careful silence that seemed to govern every adult in the household. He glanced once more toward the house, then lowered his voice regardless. "They say the old Duke was a hard man, miss, before he passed. Kept to himself something fierce, and folk feared him for it, though I never knew him myself, being too young. But the tales about a mad old Duke wandering the halls now, still living, still terrorizing this house, that's been going round the village longer than makes sense, if you think on it close. Longer than a body could stay hidden away without someone in the village catching a proper look at him." He paused, chewing his lip. "My father says rumors are like ivy, miss. Once they take hold of a wall, nobody much bothers pulling them down, whether they're true or not." "Then who is truly here?" Alara pressed, her heart beating a little faster. "If not a mad old man, then who?" But Wilfred was already shaking his head, retreating a step. "I've said more than I ought already. Please, miss, don't tell Mrs. Ashworth I spoke to you out here. I need this place, same as my father does." And before she could ask anything further, he had gathered his tools and hurried off along the garden wall, disappearing around a corner of overgrown hedge, leaving Alara alone once more among the dead flowers and creeping vines, turning his words over and over in her mind as the light continued to fail around her. She had made her way back inside just as the first heavy drops of evening rain began to fall, slipping into her chamber moments before Mrs. Ashworth arrived with her dinner tray, saying nothing of where she had been. But the boy's words stayed with her through the meal, through the long silence afterward, a small loose thread in the fabric of the house's careful secrecy, and she found herself more determined than ever to find where it led. The scream tore through the manor just after midnight, sharp and short, cut off almost as soon as it began, and Alara was on her feet before she had fully woken, her heart slamming against her ribs. For a long moment she stood frozen in the darkness of her chamber, straining to hear anything more, but the house had gone silent again, so silent that she began to doubt she had heard anything at all. Then came footsteps, quick and heavy, running somewhere below her window, followed by a door slamming and a low murmur of voices too far away to understand. Alara crossed to her own door and found it locked, as it had been every night since her arrival, and she pressed her ear against the wood, listening, her breath held tight in her chest. The voices grew closer, then faded again, moving away down some other corridor of the house. She waited, counting the beats of her own pulse, until at last there was nothing left to hear but the wind pressing against the windows and the small, ordinary creaks of an old house settling around her. She did not sleep again that night, sitting instead by the cold fireplace with a shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, watching the door and waiting for morning. When Mrs. Ashworth arrived at dawn with her usual tray, her face was pale and drawn, the careful composure of the days before noticeably strained at its edges. "I heard something last night," Alara said at once before the housekeeper could speak. "A scream and running. What happened?" Mrs. Ashworth set the tray down with hands that were not quite steady. "One of the housemaids had a fright, nothing more. She thought she saw someone in the corridor outside the kitchens and screamed before she recognized him. It gave the whole house a start, I'm afraid, myself included." "Recognized whom?" Alara asked, watching the woman's face closely. "The Duke," Mrs. Ashworth said, after a pause just long enough to notice. "He does not sleep well, and he walks the house at night sometimes when he cannot rest. She simply was not expecting to encounter him in the dark, that is all. No harm was done." "Is she well?" "Shaken but well. You needn't concern yourself." Mrs. Ashworth busied herself arranging the tray, avoiding Alara's eyes in a way that had become familiar over the past several days. "Eat your breakfast, Miss Whitmore. I have a great deal to attend to this morning, given the disturbance." She left quickly after that, locking the door out of habit before seeming to remember it was daylight and there was no need, and returning a moment later looking faintly embarrassed to unlock it again. Alara ate slowly, turning the story over in her mind. A housemaid, frightened by the sight of her own master in a dark corridor. It was plausible enough on its surface. And yet something about the speed of Mrs. Ashworth's explanation, the way it had come too quickly, too smoothly, left Alara with the same uneasy feeling she had carried since her first night in this house. The day passed slowly. Alara was left largely to herself, the household staff too occupied with whatever had truly happened the night before to attend to her as closely as usual. She used the freedom to explore the parts of the house that had been shown to her on her tour, walking the long gallery again, studying the dust-covered portraits more closely than she had the first time. Most of the faces beneath the grime were impossible to make out, but one portrait, smaller than the rest and hung in a shadowed corner near the library door, had been cleaned recently, its surface free of the dust that coated everything around it. Alara stopped before it, studying the face it revealed. A young man, dark-haired, with sharp, serious eyes and a mouth that seemed caught between a smile and something more guarded. Beneath the frame, a small brass plate read simply, Alaric. No surname, no title, just a name and a face far younger than any rumor had prepared her for. She was still standing before the portrait, lost in thought, when a voice spoke behind her, low and quiet, close enough that she startled badly and spun around with her hand pressed to her chest. He was younger then, before the weight of the house settled on him properly. The man standing in the gallery behind her was tall, dressed simply in dark clothing without any of the formal trappings she might have expected of a duke, his dark hair falling loose across his forehead in a way that suggested he had run his hands through it more than once that day. His eyes, when they met hers, were the same sharp, serious eyes from the portrait, though older now, marked by something that looked very much like exhaustion. "I did not mean to startle you," he said, when she did not immediately answer. "I should have announced myself more properly. Forgive me. It has been a difficult night, and I fear my manners have suffered for it." "You are the man from the garden," Alara said before she could stop herself. "I saw you that first night, walking near the wall." Something flickered across his face, quick and unreadable. "You have sharp eyes, Miss Whitmore. Most guests do not look closely enough at the grounds to notice much of anything in the dark." "You know my name," she said, "and yet we have not been introduced." "No," he agreed, "we have not." He glanced toward the portrait behind her, and something in his expression softened, grew almost rueful. "I only meant to check that you had settled comfortably. I heard the disturbance last night woke half the house, and I did not wish you to spend the whole day frightened without at least some explanation. Mrs. Ashworth already explained it to me. A housemaid, frightened by the sight of the Duke in a dark corridor." "Ah," he said nothing further for a long moment, and Alara found herself studying his face, searching for some resemblance to the mad, aged figure the county had described to her so many times. She found none. Whatever this man was, whatever secret the household staff worked so carefully to protect, he did not match the rumors in any way she could see. "You do not look like a man the whole county believes to be mad," she said finally, deciding that careful silence had gotten her nowhere so far, and directness might serve her better. His mouth curved, not quite a smile but close to one. "No," he agreed. "I do not suppose I do." "Then why does everyone believe it? Why does this house work so hard to keep me from learning the truth, whatever it is?" He was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away, and yet somehow held her still instead. "That," he said finally, "is a longer conversation than I have time for tonight, Miss Whitmore, and one I do not think either of us is quite ready to have honestly. But I promise you this. Whatever you have been told about this house, and about the man who lives in it, you will find the truth is stranger than the rumor, though perhaps not in the way you expect." "That is not an answer." "No," he admitted, "it is not, but it is all I can offer you tonight." He inclined his head toward her, a small, formal gesture that seemed at odds with the plainness of his dress and the tiredness in his eyes. "I am glad you were not harmed by the disturbance. Sleep well if you can manage it. I fear this house does not make that easy for anyone." He turned to go, and Alara, caught between frustration and a strange, unwilling fascination, called after him before she could stop herself. "Wait! You never told me your name." He paused at the end of the gallery, half turned back toward her, the candlelight catching the sharp lines of his face. "You already found it," he said, glancing once more toward the portrait behind her. "It has been hanging on this wall the whole time you have been here." And then he was gone, his footsteps quick and quiet down the corridor, leaving Alara alone once more beneath the painted eyes of the young man in the portrait, her mind racing with 100 questions she had not managed to ask in time. "Alaric." She said the name softly to herself, testing its shape, and found that it did not match anything she had been told to fear. She thought of the book of poetry left open in the small sitting room. She thought of the frightened housemaid, and Mrs. Ashworth's too quick explanation. She thought of the careful boundaries drawn around every conversation in this house, and the loose thread Wilfred had accidentally handed her in the garden. Something was being hidden here, carefully and deliberately, by people who seemed to believe they were protecting rather than deceiving her. And whatever it was, she suspected now, with a certainty that surprised her, that the man she had just spoken with in the gallery was at the very center of it. That night when Mrs. Ashworth came to lock her door as usual, Alara did not protest. She sat instead by her window, watching the dark garden below, and waited to see if the tall figure would appear again among the overgrown hedges. He did not come that night, but sleep, when it finally found her, was threaded through with dreams of sharp, serious eyes and a name that did not belong to any madman, and when she woke the next morning, she found that her fear of Fernhollow Manor had shifted, quietly and without her quite noticing the change, into something else entirely. Something closer to curiosity. Something closer, though she was not yet ready to name it so plainly even to herself, to the first faint stirrings of hope. The following days passed with a strange, careful rhythm. Alara saw Alaric only in glimpses, at the far end of a corridor, or crossing the garden in the gray light of early morning, always moving with the same quick, purposeful stride, always disappearing before she could catch up to him properly. Mrs. Ashworth grew no more forthcoming with information, though Alara noticed the older woman watching her more closely now, as though weighing something in her mind that she had not yet decided to share. On the fourth evening, a folded note appeared on Alara's dinner tray, tucked beneath the napkin where only she would find it. She unfolded it with careful fingers, her heart beating faster than the moment warranted. "Meet me in the small sitting room an hour past midnight if you are willing. Come alone and tell no one. There are things you deserve to know, and I find I no longer wish to keep them from you. A." Alara read the note 3 times before folding it away inside her sleeve, her mind already turning over the risk of it, the strangeness of being asked to slip through a locked house in the dead of night to meet a man the whole county believed to be dangerous. And yet, sitting there in the flickering candlelight with the note pressed against her wrist like a small, secret warmth, she found that she was not afraid at all. She was, if anything, only impatient for the hour to arrive. When Mrs. Ashworth came to lock the door that night, Alara said nothing of the note, keeping her expression carefully neutral even as her pulse quickened at the sound of the key turning in the lock. She waited a long while after the housekeeper's footsteps had faded, listening to the house settle into its usual midnight quiet, before she rose and tested the door herself, half expecting to find it as firmly locked as always. It was not. The handle turned easily under her hand, and the door swung open without a sound, as though someone had oiled its hinges that very evening in preparation. She stepped out into the dark corridor, her candle cupped carefully against the drafts that moved through the old house like slow, patient breathing, and made her way toward the small sitting room she had visited on her very first tour of the house. The corridors felt different at night, longer somehow, the shadows between the candle sconces thicker and less friendly than they had seemed in daylight. Twice she paused, certain she had heard footsteps somewhere behind her, and twice she found nothing when she turned to look, only the empty corridor stretching away into darkness. By the time she reached the sitting room door, her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. He was already there when she entered, standing by the window with his back to the door, watching the moonlit garden below. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, and in the low firelight his face looked less guarded than it had in their previous encounter, though no less tired. "You came," he said, and there was something like relief in his voice quickly hidden. "You asked me to." Elara closed the door softly behind her, glancing once toward the corridor to be certain she had not been followed. "Your note said there were things I deserved to know." "There are." He gestured toward the two chairs near the fire, the same chairs, she realized, where the book of poetry had once lain forgotten on its side table. "Please sit. This will take some explaining, and I would rather you were comfortable while I attempt it, however poorly." She sat, watching him closely as he lowered himself into the chair across from her, his hands clasped together in a way that suggested he was choosing his words with great care. "The rumors you have heard," he began finally, "of a mad old duke hidden away in this house are not entirely false. They simply do not describe the man you think they describe." He paused, meeting her eyes directly for the first time since she had entered the room. "My uncle held this title before me. He was in his final years exactly as unwell as the county believes him still to be. Difficult, withdrawn, prone to fits of temper that frightened even those who had served this family for decades. He died a little over a year ago, quietly in the West Tower, where he had confined himself for the last months of his life." "Then why does the county still believe him living?" Elara asked, leaning forward despite herself. "Because I allowed them to believe it," Alaric said simply. "When my uncle died, I inherited a title, a house falling into ruin and a great deal of trouble besides. There are relatives, distant but persistent, who would very much like to see the Fernhollow title and its remaining lands pass into their own hands, and they have not been shy about pursuing that goal through the courts, through rumor, and I suspect, through less honest means as well. Letting the old rumors persist, letting the county continue to believe my uncle still lived, gave me a kind of shelter while I worked to secure the estate properly against their claims. A man widely believed mad and half hidden away invites less scrutiny than a young duke suddenly and unexpectedly come into his inheritance." Elara sat back slowly, turning this new information over in her mind. It fit, she realized, with everything she had observed since her arrival. The careful silence of the staff, Mrs. Ashworth's guarded answers, the frightened housemaid who had, perhaps, simply encountered the true duke where she expected only rumor and shadow. "And the marriage arrangement," she said slowly. "My father was told he was sending me to the Duke of Fernhollow. Old and mad, the letter said, though they did not use those words outright. Did you know what he believed when the arrangement was made?" Something like guilt crossed Alaric's face. "The arrangement was made through intermediaries, some time ago, before my uncle's death, when he still held the title in truth. When he died, I found myself with a marriage contract I had not made and a bride arriving whose family believed her promise to a man who no longer existed. I could have written to your father and explained everything plainly. I did not." He looked down at his hands. "I told myself it was for the estate's protection, that the fewer people who knew the truth of the succession, the safer my position remained against those who would challenge it. But I will admit to you now, sitting here, that it was also simple cowardice. I did not know how to explain in a letter something I could barely explain to myself. So I was sent here believing one thing, Alara said, and arrived to find something else entirely. Yes, he admitted. And I am sorry for it, more than I have found the words to say until tonight. They sat in silence for a long moment, the fire cracking softly between them, and Alara found that her anger, which she had expected to rise sharp and immediate at his confession, came instead only as a small, distant thing, easily outweighed by relief. Whatever else was true of this strange house and its careful secrets, she was not, it seemed, promised to a madman after all. What happens now, she asked finally, now that I know the truth? That, Alaric said, depends a great deal on what you wish to happen. I will understand completely if you wish to return to your family, and I will make whatever arrangements are necessary to see you home safely and without scandal attached to your name. You did not ask for any of this, and I have no right to hold you to an arrangement built on a foundation of misunderstanding. Alara considered this for a long moment, watching the firelight play across his tired, guarded face, and found that the thought of leaving Fernhollow Manor now, with so much still unknown and unresolved, sat far less comfortably with her than she might have expected only a week before. And if I wished to stay, she said slowly, long enough at least to understand the whole of it, the relatives you mentioned, the danger to your claim, what would that require of me? Something shifted in his expression, surprise giving way to something warmer, more careful. It would require patience, he said, and discretion, and a willingness to continue living for a while longer inside a house full of secrets not entirely your own. He paused. It would also require, I think, that you trust me rather more than you currently have reason to. Then perhaps, Alara said, you ought to begin giving me reasons. For the first time since she had met him, Alaric smiled properly, and the expression transformed his tired face entirely, warmth chasing away the shadows that had settled there. I will do my best, Miss Whitmore, he said. Starting tonight, if you are willing to sit with me a while longer and let me tell you the rest of it properly from the beginning. She was willing. And so, as the fire burned low and the house settled into its deep midnight quiet around them, Alara Whitmore sat and listened, for the first time since her arrival at Fernhollow Manor, to the truth. A carriage arrived at Fernhollow Manor 3 days later, unannounced and unwelcome, its wheels churning up the gravel of the courtyard with a violence that spoke of impatience rather than respect. Alara watched from her chamber window as 2 figures stepped down from it, a stout, gray-haired man in an expensive but poorly fitted coat, and a younger woman beside him whose sharp eyes swept over the manor's facade with open calculation. Mrs. Ashworth appeared at Alara's door within minutes, her face tight with barely contained alarm. You must stay in your chamber, she said, without her usual preamble. Lord Grayson Fernhollow has arrived, and his daughter with him. The Duke will receive them, but he wishes you kept out of sight until he understands what has brought them here. Lord Grayson, Alara repeated. Alaric's relative, the one who wishes to challenge his claim. Mrs. Ashworth's eyes widened slightly, confirming that Alara now knew more than the housekeeper had expected. Then you understand why discretion matters more today than any day since your arrival. Please, Miss Whitmore. Stay here, and I will send word the moment it is safe. Alara agreed, though reluctantly, and spent the following hours pacing her chamber, straining to catch fragments of raised voices that occasionally drifted up from somewhere below. She could make out no words clearly, only tones, Alaric's low and measured, Lord Grayson's sharp and demanding, rising and falling like a distant storm that refused to break. It was well past midday when Mrs. Ashworth finally returned, looking wearier than Alara had yet seen her. They have gone, she said, closing the door behind her. For now, but I fear they will return and soon and with more than words the next time. What did they want? Alara asked. Mrs. Ashworth hesitated, then seemed to decide at last that the time for careful silence had passed. Lord Grayson believes, or claims to believe, that the old Duke's death was never properly witnessed by anyone outside this household, and that the succession to the current Duke was arranged improperly as a result. He has petitioned the courts twice already and been refused twice, but he grows bolder each time, and today he brought his daughter to press a different kind of claim entirely. What kind of claim? Marriage, Mrs. Ashworth said flatly. He proposed that his daughter, Miss Cordelia Fernhollow, marry the Duke instead, uniting the branches of the family and settling the dispute permanently, with himself, of course, standing to gain a great deal of influence over the estate as a result. He was most displeased to learn that arrangements had already been made elsewhere. Alara's stomach tightened at the words. He knows about me then. He suspected, Mrs. Ashworth said. He knows now, certainly, though the Duke gave away as little as he could manage. It will not remain a secret for long, I fear. Men like Lord Grayson do not simply accept a closed door. They look for the gap beneath it. That evening, Alaric came to find Alara himself rather than send word through Mrs. Ashworth, his face drawn with an exhaustion that went beyond simple tiredness. He found her in the small sitting room, where she had taken to spending her evenings now that the household's careful boundaries had begun, slowly, to loosen around her. "I am sorry you had to hide away like a guilty secret today," he said, lowering himself into the chair across from her. "It was not how I wished to handle his visit, but I did not trust what he might do if he learned of your presence too plainly, too soon." "Mrs. Ashworth told me what he wanted," Alara said. "His daughter in my place." "Cordelia is not to blame for her father's ambitions," Alaric said, with something that sounded almost like sympathy. "I do not believe she wishes this marriage any more than I do. But Lord Grayson has never been a man to let his daughter's preferences interfere with his own designs, and I fear he sees this house, and this title, as something owed to him rather than something I hold by right." "Is there truth to his claim, about your uncle's death not being properly witnessed?" Alaric's jaw tightened. "There is enough truth in it to be dangerous if he presents it cleverly to the right magistrate. My uncle died quietly in the night, with only myself and Mrs. Ashworth present. No physician came in time to confirm the cause before he had already been laid to rest, given how quickly illness took him at the end. It was not improper, but it was not as thoroughly documented as it might have been, and Lord Grayson has built a great deal of noise around that single gap in the record." "What happens if he succeeds, if the courts side with him?" "Then the title and everything attached to it passes to him," Alaric said quietly. "The estate, the tenants who depend on it, this house itself. I have spent the past year trying to secure proper documentation, proper witnesses, proper legal footing, precisely because I understand what is at stake if I fail. It has been slow work, and expensive, and it is why I could not simply write to your father and explain our situation honestly when you first arrived. I did not know, until very recently, whether I would still hold this title by the time you reached my door." Alara studied his face in the firelight, seeing now the weight he carried beneath his careful composure, the exhaustion that came not from madness, as the rumors claimed, but from a year spent fighting quietly and alone to hold together everything his uncle had left him. "You should have told me all of this from the beginning," she said, though gently. "I know," he admitted. "I told myself I was protecting you from a burden that was not yours to carry. I see now that I was only protecting myself from having to admit, out loud, how uncertain everything here truly is." He met her eyes. "I will understand if this changes your answer about staying." Alara considered this for a long moment. She thought of her father's letter, still folded away in her traveling case, and the family debts that had sent her here in the first place. She thought of the mad Duke she had been promised, and the tired, honest man who sat before her instead, fighting to hold together a house and a title and a household of people who depended on him. She thought, too, of Lord Grayson's sharp-eyed daughter, stepping down from that carriage with such open calculation, and felt a small, unexpected flare of something that was not quite jealousy, but sat uncomfortably close to it. "It does not change my answer," she said finally. "If anything, it makes me more determined to see this settled properly and in your favor." Something in Alaric's face eased, a tension she had not fully noticed until it began to loosen. "Then I will need your help if you are truly willing to give it. There are records in this house, old letters and documents belonging to my uncle that I have not had time to properly search through. Somewhere among them, I believe, is the proof I need, a witnessed account, a physician's note, something that closes the gap Lord Grayson has been so eager to exploit. I simply have not had the hours to search properly, between managing the estate and fending off his visits. Then let me search, Alara said. I have little else to occupy my days here, and I would rather spend them helping to secure your claim than hiding away in my chamber every time his carriage appears in the courtyard. Alaric studied her for a long moment, something warm and grateful passing across his tired features. "Thank you," he said simply. "I did not expect, when you arrived here believing me some mad old recluse, that you would offer to fight this battle alongside me instead of fleeing from it." "I did not expect it either," Alara admitted, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it entirely. Whatever she had imagined when her father's letter first arrived, whatever fear had followed her on the long carriage ride through the storm, it had settled now into something else, something steadier, and she found she was not sorry for the change at all. That night, after Alaric had gone and Mrs. Ashworth had come to lock her door for the evening, Alara lay awake a long while, listening to the wind press against the old windows, and thought not of madness or danger, but of the work ahead of her, and the strange, unexpected alliance she had found herself building with a man the whole county still believed to be something he was not. Outside, somewhere beyond the garden wall, the road that had brought Lord Grayson's carriage to Fernhollow Manor lay quiet and dark, waiting, she suspected, for his return. She began her search the following morning, in a small study tucked behind the library that Alaric showed her himself, its shelves crowded with ledgers, correspondence, and bundles of papers tied with fading ribbon, none of it organized in any way that made sense to her at first glance. "My uncle kept records the way he kept everything else," Alaric said apologetically, gesturing at the disorder. "Reluctantly, and without much care for whether anyone else would ever need to make sense of them. I have gone through perhaps half of this myself over the past year, whenever I could spare the hours. I confess I have not always known what I was looking for, only that I would recognize it when I found it." "Then I will start where you left off," Alara said, already reaching for the nearest bundle of papers, "and we will simply have to hope that whatever we need is still waiting to be found." The work was slow and often tedious, hour after hour spent untying ribbons and unfolding brittle paper, reading through decades of household accounts, tenant disputes, and half-finished letters that led nowhere useful. But Alara found she did not mind the tedium as much as she might have expected. There was a quiet satisfaction in the careful, methodical work, and more than once Alaric joined her for an hour at a time between his other duties, the two of them working in companionable silence, broken only by the occasional exclamation over some particularly strange or outdated document. It was on the third day of searching that she found it, tucked inside the back pages of a household ledger where it had clearly been placed for safekeeping, rather than filed properly among the other papers. A short letter, written in an unfamiliar hand and dated some weeks before the old Duke's death, addressed to Mrs. Ashworth from a physician in the nearest town, describing a visit made to examine the Duke's declining health and recommending, in careful medical language, that arrangements be made for his comfort in his final weeks. "Alaric," Alara called, her voice sharp with excitement, and he appeared in the study doorway within moments, drawn by the urgency in her tone. "Look at this. A physician did examine your uncle weeks before his death. This proves his illness was documented, that there was medical awareness of his decline well before the end." Alaric took the letter from her carefully, reading it twice, his expression shifting from cautious hope to something closer to relief as he reached the final lines. "This is dated and signed," he said. "If this physician can be found and can confirm his own hand, this alone may be enough to close much of the gap Lord Grayson has been exploiting. Why was this never filed with the rest of the estate records?" "Perhaps your uncle did not wish anyone to know how unwell he truly was," Alara suggested. "Mrs. Ashworth may have kept it hidden out of loyalty to him, rather than carelessness." They found Mrs. Ashworth in the kitchen a short while later, and when Alaric showed her the letter, her face went through a rapid succession of expressions: surprise, recognition, and finally something like relief of her own. "I had forgotten it entirely," she admitted. "Your uncle asked me to keep it from the other staff, fearing they would gossip about his condition if they knew how serious it had become. I tucked it away, and in the grief and confusion after his passing, I confess it slipped my mind completely. I am sorry, Your Grace. I should have thought to search for it myself, long before now." "You have nothing to apologize for," Alaric said. "You have done more for this house, and for me, than I have any right to ask of you. This is good news, perhaps the best we have found in a year of searching." He turned to Alara, and the warmth in his expression made her chest tighten in a way she did not quite know how to name. "We will need to find this physician and secure his testimony properly before Lord Grayson returns. But this is more progress than I dared hope for, and I owe it entirely to your patience this past week." Alara felt a small, quiet glow of pride at his words, and found herself looking forward, for the first time since her arrival at Fernhollow Manor, not to the day she might finally return home, but to whatever came next within these walls. The physician's name, once they had found it properly recorded, proved harder to trace than either of them had hoped. A letter sent to the town where he had once practiced returned word that he had retired some years before and moved, though no one could say precisely where. Alaric spent 2 full days away from the manor chasing leads through the county, leaving Alara alone with Mrs. Ashworth and the quiet, watchful rhythm of the house. And it was during his absence that Cordelia Fernhollow returned, alone this time, without her father's carriage or his blustering presence. Alara was walking in the garden, following the same overgrown paths she had first explored weeks before, when she came upon the other woman standing near the dry fountain, dressed in traveling clothes far finer than anything Alara owned, her sharp eyes studying the manor's crumbling facade with an expression Alara could not quite read. "You must be Miss Whitmore," Cordelia said, before Alara could decide whether to retreat. "I had heard my father's suspicions confirmed, but I confess I did not entirely believe it until now." "And you are Lord Grayson's daughter," Alara said carefully, unsure whether she was facing an enemy or simply a woman as caught up in her father's ambitions as she herself had once been caught up in her own father's debts. "Cordelia," the woman said with a small, humorless smile, "though I suspect you already knew that." She glanced toward the house again, her expression unreadable. "I did not come to cause trouble, Miss Whitmore, whatever you may have been told to expect of my family. I came because I wish to see for myself whether the arrangement my father proposes is one I could bear to accept. And I find, having stood here a quarter of an hour, that I already know the answer." "What answer is that?" "That I have no wish to marry a man I have never properly met, in a house I do not know, simply to settle a dispute that belongs entirely to my father and not to me." Cordelia's voice carried a weariness that surprised Alara, a bitterness that seemed to run deeper than simple disappointment at a failed arrangement. "My father sees this estate as something owed to our branch of the family, a wrong to be righted after years of feeling passed over. I understand his grievance, in its way. But I do not wish to spend my own life as the instrument of settling it." Alara studied the other woman carefully, weighing whether to trust the sincerity in her voice. "Then why come here at all, if not to press the claim?" "Because my father does not know I have come," Cordelia said, "and because I wish to warn you, since it seems no one else in this house has thought to do so plainly. My father does not intend to let this matter rest with the courts alone. He has grown convinced that patience will not win him what he believes he is owed, and he has begun speaking, in private, of more direct means of settling the question of succession. I do not know precisely what he intends, and I would not put it past him to have said such things simply to frighten me into compliance. But I thought you and the Duke ought to know that his patience is running thin, and men whose patience runs thin do not always act wisely." A cold unease settled over Alara at the words. "Have you told anyone else this?" "No one," Cordelia said. "I would ask that you not reveal where the warning came from if you can manage it. I have little enough freedom as it is, Without my father discovering, I came here against his wishes to speak with the very woman standing between him and his ambitions." She paused, studying Alara with an expression that had softened somewhat since their conversation began. "For what it is worth, Miss Whitmore, I hope the Duke's claim holds. I have heard enough, growing up in my father's house, to know that ambition dressed up as justice rarely serves anyone well in the end, least of all the people caught beneath it." She left soon after, refusing Alara's offer to bring her inside for tea, insisting she needed to be gone before her absence was noticed and questioned. Alara watched her disappear down the long drive on foot, having apparently walked some distance from wherever she had left her own carriage waiting out of sight, and felt the cold unease of the warning settle deeper into her chest as the other woman's figure grew small and finally vanished around the bend of the road. She told Mrs. Ashworth as soon as she returned to the house, and watched the housekeeper's face grow pale and tight with worry. "We must send word to the Duke at once," Mrs. Ashworth said. "He needs to know before he returns so that he is not caught unprepared." A rider was sent that same afternoon, and Alaric returned the following evening, 2 days earlier than planned, his face drawn with a new kind of urgency that had not been there before his journey. He found Alara in the small sitting room, and listened without interruption as she repeated Cordelia's warning as precisely as she could remember it. "I had hoped he would exhaust himself with lawyers and petitions," Alaric said, once she had finished, "rather than turn to anything more direct. I should not be surprised, I suppose. My uncle always said Grayson was a man who mistook stubbornness for strength, and strength for the right to take whatever he believed himself owed." "What will you do?" "Strengthen the house," Alaric said. "More staff at the gates, word sent to the local magistrate so that if anything untoward does occur, there is already a record of the warning on file, and I will need to move faster on securing the physician's testimony before Grayson decides waiting for the courts is no longer worth his patience." He looked at her then, his expression troubled in a new way. "I do not like that this puts you at any greater risk than you already faced simply by being here. If you wish to return to your family until this is settled more safely, I would understand completely, and arrange for it myself." "I have already told you my answer to that question," Alara said, more firmly than she felt, though she found, examining her own heart, that the firmness was not entirely false. "I did not come this far and learn this much, only to leave now because the danger has become plainer than it was before." Alaric studied her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his tired eyes, gratitude and worry, and something else besides that Alara did not trust herself to name. "You are a remarkable woman, Alara Whitmore," he said quietly, using her given name for the first time since they had met. "I do not think I have properly told you that, in all the weeks since your arrival. You have been rather occupied with lawsuits and hidden letters," Alara said, though her voice had gone softer than she intended, and something warm rose in her chest at the sound of her own name in his voice. "I will forgive the oversight, given the circumstances." He smiled at that, briefly, the tiredness in his face easing for just a moment before the weight of everything else settled back over him. "We should not linger too long on pleasant conversation," he said, though he did not immediately move to end it. "There is a great deal to prepare if Grayson truly means to act rather than simply threaten. But I wanted you to know, before I turn my attention back to the practical matters ahead of us, that I am grateful you did not leave when you had every reason to. This house has felt less like a fortress and more like a home these past weeks than it has in a very long while, and I believe that change has a great deal to do with you." Alara did not know how to answer that properly, and so she said nothing at all, only reached across the small space between their chairs and let her hand rest briefly against his, a small gesture that felt, in that moment, far larger than its size. He did not pull away. For a long moment, neither of them moved, the fire crackling softly between them. The weight of Cordelia's warning and Lord Grayson's growing impatience pressed temporarily to the edges of the room by something quieter and warmer that had grown, almost without either of them noticing, in the weeks since Alara's arrival. It was Mrs. Ashworth's knock, some minutes later, that finally broke the moment, bringing word that additional staff had arrived at the gates as Alaric had requested, and that preparations for the house's greater security were already underway. Alara withdrew her hand, and Alaric rose to attend to the practical business of protecting his home and everyone within it. But something had shifted between them in that quiet hour, something neither of them spoke of directly, but that neither, she suspected, had entirely forgotten either. That night, lying awake in her chamber long after Mrs. Ashworth had come to lock the door, Alara found her thoughts circling not around fear of what Lord Grayson might attempt, but around the memory of Alaric's hand beneath her own, and the quiet certainty, settling deeper into her heart with every passing day, that whatever came next at Fernhollow Manor, she no longer wished to face it from anywhere but his side. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows as it always did, and somewhere beyond the garden wall, new lanterns burned at the gate where extra staff now stood watch through the long hours of the night. A small, steady light against whatever darkness Lord Grayson's growing impatience might yet bring to their door. Word came 2 days later that the physician had at last been located, living quietly in a coastal town some hours away, retired from practice but still sound of mind and willing, once approached properly, to confirm the letter as his own and to swear to its contents before a magistrate. Alaric received the news with visible relief, and immediately began arranging for the man to be brought to the manor under careful escort, unwilling to risk any delay that might give Lord Grayson further opportunity to act before the testimony could be secured. That same night, however, the household's new vigilance proved its worth sooner than anyone had hoped. Alara woke sometime after midnight to raised voices near the gate, distant but unmistakably urgent, and the sound of running feet crossing the courtyard below her window. She rose quickly, pulling a shawl around her shoulders, and found her door unlocked, left so, she realized, because the household had been too occupied with the disturbance to attend to their usual routines. She made her way down the main staircase, drawn by the commotion despite every instinct that told her to remain safely in her chamber, and found the entrance hall filled with lantern light and low, urgent conversation. Alaric stood near the doors, fully dressed despite the hour, speaking with 2 of the newly hired gate staff, his expression tight with controlled anger. "What has happened?" Alara asked, and he turned at the sound of her voice, his expression easing slightly at the sight of her, though the tension in his shoulders did not fully release. "Someone attempted to enter the grounds through the old service gate on the eastern wall," he said. "The staff there caught sight of a figure moving along the wall in the dark and raised the alarm before anything could come of it. Whoever it was fled into the trees before they could be caught or identified properly." "Do you believe it was sent by Lord Grayson?" "I believe it very likely," Alaric said grimly. "Though I have no proof of it yet, nothing that would hold before a magistrate. It may simply have been an opportunistic thief, drawn by rumors of a wealthy but poorly guarded house. But I do not think it wise to assume the more innocent explanation, given everything Cordelia warned us of." The household did not sleep much for the remainder of that night, lanterns burning at every entrance until dawn finally broke gray and quiet over the garden, revealing nothing more sinister in the trampled grass near the eastern wall than a single set of footprints leading away into the woods beyond the property line. No further sign of the intruder was found, but the incident settled a new seriousness over the house that had not been there before, a sense that whatever quiet, careful work Alaric had been doing to secure his claim now existed alongside a more immediate and pressing danger. The physician arrived 3 days later, an elderly, soft-spoken man named Edmund Carow, who confirmed the letter as his own without hesitation and agreed readily to provide sworn testimony regarding the old duke's declining health in the weeks before his death. Alaric arranged for a magistrate to take the testimony formally that same week, and for the first time since Alara had arrived at Fernhollow Manor, she watched something like genuine hope settle over his tired features, hope that the legal foundation of his claim might soon stand secure enough to withstand whatever Lord Grayson attempted next, whether through the courts or through darker means entirely. "This does not end things," Alaric told her, Once Mr. Carrow had been safely seen off after giving his testimony, the household finally able to breathe a little easier than it had in days. Grayson will not simply accept defeat because one gap in the record has been closed. But it removes his strongest argument, and it will make any further attempt at direct interference far harder for him to justify, even to himself. "Then we have won something at least," Alara said. "We have won something," Alaric agreed, and the warmth in the way he said we did not escape her notice, nor did it go unnoticed by her own heart, which had grown steadily fonder of this careful, burdened man with every difficult week they had faced together since her arrival. Lord Grayson's carriage returned to Fernhollow Manor a fortnight later, but this time it did not come alone. 3 other carriages followed behind it, and as they rolled to a stop in the courtyard, Alara, watching from her window once more, counted more than a dozen men climbing down from them, none dressed as gentlemen, all of them carrying themselves with the rough, purposeful bearing of men hired for a task rather than guests arriving for polite conversation. She did not wait for Mrs. Ashworth to come and warn her this time. She hurried from her chamber and found Alaric already in the entrance hall, his face pale and set, watching the same scene unfold through the tall windows beside the door. "He means to force the matter," Alaric said quietly, more to himself than to her as she reached his side. "I did not think he would go this far, whatever Cordelia warned us of." "What do we do?" "We do not open the doors to him," Alaric said. "Whatever claim he believes he holds, he has no lawful right to enter this house by force, and I will not give him the chance to say otherwise before a magistrate later. Gather the staff. Bar the lower doors. I have already sent word to the local magistrate this morning, when the watch first reported unfamiliar riders approaching along the eastern road. If we can hold until help arrives, Grayson will have no argument left to make that does not condemn him entirely." The household moved quickly, doors barred, windows checked, the small staff gathering in the entrance hall with a tense, watchful energy that reminded Alara uncomfortably of the night the intruder had first been spotted at the eastern wall. Outside, Lord Grayson's voice rose loud and demanding, pounding on the great front doors and shouting for the Duke to come out and answer for what he called a fraudulent claim held over property that was rightfully his own. Alaric stepped to the window, close enough to be seen and heard without opening the door itself, and Alara watched him gather himself, the tiredness and worry of the past weeks folding away beneath a composed, steady authority she had not seen from him before. "Lord Grayson," he called out, his voice carrying clearly despite the barrier of glass and wood between them. "You will find no fraud here, only a claim properly documented and properly witnessed, as the courts have already confirmed twice over. I would ask you to remove your men from my property before this becomes a matter for the magistrate, rather than simply an unpleasant visit. Your claim rests on a single letter conveniently discovered only weeks ago," Grayson shouted back, his face red with anger visible even from the window. "A letter any competent forger could produce given time and motive enough. I will not stand aside while you rob my family of what is rightfully ours, boy, whatever paper trail you have managed to construct around it." "The letter has been sworn to by the physician who wrote it before a magistrate with proper witnesses present," Alaric answered, his voice hardening. "You may challenge it in court, as is your right. You do not have the right to bring armed men to my door and demand entry by force. I would advise you strongly to leave now, before your actions today become evidence against you rather than for you." For a long, tense moment, nothing happened, Grayson's men shifting uneasily near the courtyard while their employer stood rigid with fury, clearly weighing whether to press the matter further or accept the setback for now. Then, in the distance, the sound of approaching riders reached them, several horses moving quickly along the drive, and a moment later the local magistrate himself appeared at the head of a small party, having received Alaric's earlier warning and moved with unusual speed to answer it. Grayson's fury dimmed visibly at the sight of official authority arriving on the scene, and though he argued loudly with the magistrate for several minutes, gesturing angrily toward the house and repeating his claims of fraud and improper succession, the magistrate remained unmoved, informing him plainly that any further attempt to force entry to the manor would result in immediate arrest, whatever grievance he believed himself to hold. Alara watched from the window as Lord Grayson finally, furiously, ordered his men back into their carriages, casting one last venomous look toward the house before climbing into his own carriage and departing down the long drive, the magistrate's party escorting him a fair distance to ensure he did not simply circle back once out of sight. The household did not fully relax until word came, some hours later, that Grayson's carriages had been seen passing well beyond the county boundary, apparently retreating for the time being to consider his next move. Alaric sank into a chair in the small sitting room that evening, looking more exhausted than Alara had ever seen him, the composed authority he had shown at the window entirely spent now that the immediate danger had passed. "He will not simply accept this," he said quietly, as Alara sat beside him, pressing a cup of tea into his hands that he accepted more out of habit than any real desire for it. Today was a defeat for him, but men like Grayson do not learn from defeat so much as they grow more determined by it. "Perhaps," Alara said. But today he also revealed himself plainly before a magistrate, as a man willing to bring armed force to a neighbor's door over a legal dispute already twice decided against him. That is not nothing, whatever he attempts next. Alaric managed a tired smile at that. "You have grown rather sharp in matters of law and reputation these past weeks." "I have had a good teacher," Alara said, "and a great deal of motivation to learn quickly." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the fire burning low, the exhaustion of the day settling over both of them in a way that felt, for the first time, more like relief than fear. It was Mrs. Ashworth who finally interrupted, entering with a fresh pot of tea and news that had arrived just moments before by rider from the county seat. "The magistrate sends word," she said, "that Lord Grayson's conduct today will be entered formally into the record of his ongoing petition, and that his standing before the court has been considerably weakened by it. He believes, given today's events combined with the physician's sworn testimony, that the matter is likely to be settled decisively in your favor within the month, Your Grace." Alaric closed his eyes briefly, something like disbelief crossing his tired features before giving way slowly to genuine relief. "Within the month," he repeated softly. "After a year of quiet, careful work, and it may finally be settled within the month." "You have earned that outcome," Alara said, watching him carefully. "Whatever doubts you carried when I first arrived here, you have spent this past year fighting honestly for what belongs to you, and today Lord Grayson proved, before witnesses who matter, exactly what kind of man opposes you." Alaric looked at her then, something warm and unguarded moving across his face that she had glimpsed only in small pieces before this moment. "I could not have held this ground alone these past weeks," he said quietly. "I want you to know that plainly, whatever else remains unsaid between us. Your presence here has changed a great many things I did not expect to have changed, and I find I am deeply grateful for every one of them." Alara felt her own heart lift at his words, warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the tea in her hands or the fire burning nearby. "Then perhaps," she said softly, "we ought to stop speaking as though my presence here were still some temporary arrangement, waiting only for the danger to pass before I return to my father's house." "Perhaps we ought," Alaric agreed, and reached across the small space between them to take her hand properly this time. No longer a brief, uncertain touch, but something steadier. Something that felt, in the quiet warmth of that fire-lit room, very much like a promise neither of them was yet ready to speak aloud, though both, Alara suspected, had already made it plainly enough in their hearts. Outside, the last light of evening faded over the garden, and the manor settled into its quiet night rhythms once more, the danger of the day's confrontation slowly loosening its grip on the household as the hours passed. But Alara, sitting close beside Alaric in the firelight, found that her thoughts had already moved past the danger entirely, settling instead on the strange, unexpected turn her life had taken since that first frightening carriage ride through the storm, and on the man beside her, who had turned out to be nothing at all like the rumors had promised, and everything she was beginning to realize that she had not known she was looking for. The following morning brought an unexpected visitor, though a far gentler one than the day before. Cordelia arrived on foot again, as she had the first time, slipping through the garden gate with a caution that suggested she still did not wish her presence widely known. Alara found her near the same dry fountain where they had first spoken, and this time there was no hesitation in the way Cordelia greeted her. "I heard what happened here yesterday," Cordelia said, without preamble. "My father returned home in a fury I have rarely seen equal, shouting about magistrates and forged letters until well past midnight. I wished to see for myself that you and the Duke had come through it unharmed." "We are both quite well," Alara assured her, "thanks in no small part to your warning. Without it, we might not have prepared the house properly, and yesterday could have gone very differently." Something like relief crossed Cordelia's face. "I am glad of it, then. I have spent the past fortnight fearing my father would do something even I could not have predicted, and dreading that I had not warned you clearly enough to matter." She hesitated, glancing toward the manor's tall windows. "I do not know what will become of my own position, once this is fully settled. My father will not easily forgive what he will see as my disloyalty, if he ever learns of it. But I find I would rather bear his anger than carry the guilt of having stayed silent, while he brought harm to people who had done nothing to deserve it." "You are welcome here," Alara said, surprising herself with the sincerity of the offer, "whatever comes of your father's anger. I do not think either the Duke or I could easily forget the debt we owe you." Cordelia's expression softened into something almost like the beginning of friendship, rare and careful, the kind that grows slowly between two people who have found themselves, against expectation, on the same side of a difficult matter. "Perhaps, once this is all settled properly, I will take you up on that offer," she said. "For now, I should return before my absence is noticed. But I wanted you to know, Miss Whitmore, that whatever my father's ambitions, I do not share them, and I am glad, truly, that things have turned out as they have for you and the Duke." She left as quietly as she had come, and Alara made her way back inside to find Alaric already awake, seated at the small writing desk in his study with a fresh letter from the magistrate spread before him. "Good news," he said, looking up as she entered. "The court has set a date for the final hearing, 3 weeks from now. With the physician's testimony entered into record, along with a formal account of yesterday's confrontation, the magistrate believes the matter will be resolved swiftly and firmly in my favor. Grayson's petition," he writes, "has grown considerably weaker with each attempt to press it by improper means." 3 weeks, Alara repeated, feeling the number settle into her chest with a strange mixture of relief and something else, something that felt almost like reluctance at the idea of this careful, dangerous chapter of her life drawing so near to its close. "And after that, what becomes of Fernhollow Manor?" "After that," Alaric said, setting down the letter and rising to meet her properly, "I hope very much that it becomes, at last, simply a home. Not a fortress to be defended, not a secret to be guarded, but a house where the truth is finally allowed to stand in the open, without fear of what it might cost us." He paused, studying her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I hope, too, that it becomes a home you might consider your own, properly and permanently, rather than a place you were merely sent to by circumstances neither of us chose." Alara felt her heart lift at the words, warmth spreading through her that had little to do with the fire crackling nearby and everything to do with the man standing before her, his tired eyes now bright with something that looked very much like hope. "I believe," she said softly, "that it already has become that, whatever the courts decide in 3 weeks' time." Alaric's answering smile was the warmest she had yet seen from him, and for a long, quiet moment, the two of them stood together in the morning light of his study. The danger of Lord Grayson's ambitions and the uncertainty of the weeks ahead pushed gently to the edges of their thoughts by something steadier and far more hopeful growing quietly between them. The 3 weeks leading to the hearing passed differently than any period Alara had known since her arrival at Fernhollow Manor. The fear that had once colored every corner of the old house seemed to lift a little more each day, replaced gradually by a cautious, hopeful energy that touched even the household staff, who had grown visibly more relaxed in their master's presence now that the worst of the danger appeared to have passed. Alara spent her mornings continuing the work she had begun in the estate's study, no longer searching desperately for a single crucial document, but instead helping Alaric organize the household's tangled records into something more orderly, a task he confessed he had been dreading for a year, and was grateful, finally, to face with company rather than alone. Their afternoons often found them walking together in the garden, which Alaric had begun, slowly, to reclaim from years of neglect, clearing paths and pulling weeds alongside Wilfred and his father, with an enthusiasm that surprised the household nearly as much as it delighted Alara. "You did not strike me, when I first arrived, as a man who enjoyed working with his hands in the dirt," she said one afternoon, watching him straighten from clearing a tangle of dead vines with visible satisfaction at the small patch of cleared earth before him. "I did not strike myself as such a man either, until this past year forced a great many things upon me I had not expected," he admitted, wiping his hands on his coat in a gesture so like Wilfred's that Alara could not help but smile. "There is something steadying about it, I find. A garden does not care about lawsuits or false rumors. It only asks that you tend it honestly, and it rewards that honesty in its own quiet way." "Then perhaps that is what this house has needed most all along," Alara said. "Someone willing to tend it honestly rather than simply defend it." Alaric looked at her for a long moment, something warm and unguarded in his expression. "I believe you may be right," he said, "though I confess I did not fully understand that myself until you arrived here and began asking questions no one else had thought to ask." Their growing closeness did not go unnoticed by the household. Mrs. Ashworth, who had once guarded every word so carefully, began speaking with Alara more openly with each passing day, sharing small memories of the old Duke's better years, of the house as it had once been before grief and isolation settled over it, and of her own quiet hope, unspoken until now, that its master might finally find some measure of happiness after so long spent fighting simply to survive. "He has not smiled so often, nor so easily, in all the years I have known him," Mrs. Ashworth confided one evening, as she helped Alara prepare for a rare formal dinner Alaric had arranged to celebrate the approaching hearing. "Not since before his uncle's decline began, and perhaps not even then. I think this house forgot, for a long while, what it was to hold anything but sorrow within its walls. I am glad, Miss Whitmore, more glad than I know how to properly say, that you arrived here to remind it otherwise." The dinner itself was a small, quiet affair, just the two of them in the great dining hall that had sat empty and shrouded for so long, its finer furnishings finally uncovered for the occasion, candles lit along its length for the first time in what Mrs. Ashworth swore was well over a year. Alaric had dressed properly for the evening, and Alara found herself struck anew by how little he resembled, in every way that mattered, the mad old Duke the county had spent so long fearing. "I wished for us to have one proper evening before the hearing," he said, as they settled at the table together, closer than its full length might have suggested was necessary. "Whatever the court decides, I wanted at least one night where we could simply enjoy each other's company, without the weight of Grayson's ambitions pressing down upon it." "Do you doubt the outcome then?" Alara asked, watching his face carefully. "No," he said, after a moment's consideration. "I believe truly that the evidence stands strongly in my favor now, and that Grayson's own conduct has done as much to weaken his case as anything we have gathered ourselves. But I have learned, this past year, not to take any certainty for granted until it has been properly secured. I would rather celebrate what we have already built together tonight, regardless of what tomorrow brings, than wait for a court's permission to do so." Something in his words settled warmly into Alara's chest, and she found herself reaching across the table to take his hand, no longer hesitant in the gesture as she had once been. "Then let us celebrate it properly," she said. "Whatever the court decides, I do not regret a single day I have spent within these walls, however frightened I may have been when I first arrived." They talked long into the evening, of small things mostly, favorite books and half-forgotten childhood memories. The kind of easy, unguarded conversation that had been impossible between them in the tense, secretive weeks of Alara's first days at Fernhollow Manor. It was only as the candles burned low that Alaric grew more serious again, his hand tightening gently around hers. "I wish to ask you something," he said, "though I confess I have not fully worked out how best to say it. When this hearing is settled, and my claim to this title stands secure beyond any further challenge, I would like very much for our arrangement to become something real, rather than the misunderstanding it began as. Not a marriage forced upon either of us by circumstance, but one chosen freely by both of us for what it has genuinely become." Alara felt her breath catch, warmth flooding through her chest at words she had, perhaps, been hoping for without fully admitting it to herself. "I would like that very much," she said softly. "Though I would ask that you wait to make it official until the hearing is truly behind us. I do not wish anyone, least of all Lord Grayson, to say that our happiness was built on anything less than solid ground." "A wise condition," Alaric agreed, smiling properly now, the expression transforming his tired face into something younger, lighter than she had yet seen it. "Then we shall wait. 3 more weeks have already passed more easily than I expected, given everything we faced together. A few more days until the hearing is settled should pass easily enough as well." The evening ended quietly, the two of them parting at Alara's chamber door with a warmth that had grown, slowly and steadily, into something neither of them any longer doubted. As Mrs. Ashworth came to lock the door out of long habit, though the practice had grown gentler now, more a courtesy than a true confinement, Alara found herself smiling at the strange turn her life had taken, from a frightened girl sent unknowingly into a stranger's chamber, to a woman who had found, within those same walls, something she had never expected to find at all. 2 days before the hearing, however, a new difficulty arrived, carried not by carriage this time but by word from the village, brought to the manor by Wilfred's father with visible reluctance in his weathered face. "Forgive me for troubling you, your grace," the older man said, standing uneasily near the kitchen door while Mrs. Ashworth fetched Alaric from his study. "But I thought you ought to know what's being said in the village these past days. Lord Grayson's men have been down at the tavern, spreading word that the physician who signed that letter was paid handsomely for his testimony, and that the whole thing is nothing but a clever arrangement between yourself and a man willing to say whatever he was told to say." Alaric's jaw tightened at the news, though his voice remained steady. "Thank you for telling me plainly. I would rather know what is being said than discover it only once it has done its damage." Once the groundskeeper had gone, Alaric turned to Alara with visible frustration. "This is exactly the sort of thing he excels at," he said. "He cannot win in the courtroom any longer, so he attempts instead to win in the minds of anyone who might sit upon a jury, or whisper doubt into the magistrate's ear before the hearing even begins." "Then we must answer it plainly before it can take root," Alara said. "Mr. Carrow gave his testimony freely and under oath. If Lord Grayson wishes to accuse him of taking a bribe, let him say so formally, where such a claim can be examined and disproven, rather than whispered over ale where no one can properly challenge it." Alaric considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You are right. I will write to Mr. Carrow myself, and ask that he be present at the hearing in person, prepared to answer any such accusation directly before the magistrate, rather than leaving his testimony to stand only on paper where rumor can more easily attack it. And I will ask the local rector, who has known this family for decades and has no reason to favor either side, to speak plainly to his congregation about the difference between an old man's grief-driven wandering, once whispered about, and the outright falsehoods now being spread by a man desperate to win by any means left to him." The following 2 days passed in a flurry of careful preparation, letters sent and answered quickly, Mr. Carrow's agreement secured to appear personally at the hearing, and the rector, true to Alaric's hope, addressing the matter gently but firmly from his pulpit that Sunday, reminding the village that idle talk spread by desperate men ought not to be mistaken for truth simply because it arrived first and loudest. By the time the morning of the hearing finally arrived, Alara found that whatever doubt Lord Grayson's whispered rumors might have planted in the county's mind had been met, at every turn, with steady, patient truth, offered plainly and without fear. She stood beside Alaric in the manor's entrance hall as the carriage was brought around to take them to the county seat, both of them dressed with the same careful formality they had worn at their quiet celebratory dinner days before, and found that her heart, though it beat quickly with anticipation, carried no trace of the fear that had once ruled every hour of her life within these walls. "Whatever happens today," Alaric said quietly, as he helped her into the carriage, "I want you to know that facing it with you beside me has made it a great deal easier to bear than facing it alone ever was." "Then let us face it together," Alara said, "and put Lord Grayson's ambitions to rest once and for all." The hearing was only hours away now, and whatever the court decided, Alara found that she faced it not with the fear that had followed her on that first stormy carriage ride, but with a steady, quiet confidence in the man beside her, and in the home they had built together against every rumor the county had ever whispered about Fernhollow Manor. The county courthouse stood crowded that morning, far more crowded than Alara had expected, word of the dispute having spread widely enough through the county that curious neighbors and distant acquaintances of both families had gathered to witness its final resolution. She sat beside Alaric near the front of the chamber, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching as Lord Grayson entered from the opposite side, his face set in an expression of grim determination that did little to hide the uncertainty beneath it. The magistrate opened proceedings with a brief summary of the matter before the court, the disputed succession of the Fernhollow title, the physician's testimony now formally entered into record, and the additional matter of Lord Grayson's conduct during his armed visit to the manor some weeks prior, which the magistrate noted gravely would be weighed alongside the primary question of inheritance. Lord Grayson's counsel rose first, arguing once more that the physician's letter, however sincerely sworn to now, had been conveniently discovered only after the succession dispute had already begun, and suggesting, carefully worded to avoid outright accusation, that its timing invited reasonable doubt. It was then that Mr. Carrow himself rose, as arranged, to address the court directly. The elderly physician spoke plainly and without hesitation, describing his visit to the old Duke in careful medical detail, confirming the letter as his own handwriting, and stating firmly that he had received no payment nor promise of any kind for his testimony beyond the simple request that he tell the truth of what he had witnessed. "I am an old man," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed chamber, "with little left to gain from lying to this court, and a great deal to lose in reputation should I be caught doing so. I signed that letter a year ago because it was true then, and I swear to its contents today for the same simple reason." Whatever doubt Lord Grayson's whispered rumors had managed to plant in the county's mind seemed to waver visibly at the old physician's steady testimony, and Alara felt Alaric's hand find hers beneath the edge of the table where they sat, gripping it tightly with something that felt very much like cautious hope. The rector spoke next, offering his own account of the old Duke's decline as he himself had witnessed it during pastoral visits in the final months, corroborating the physician's testimony with the quiet authority of a man well known and trusted throughout the county. And then, to Alara's surprise, a final witness was called forward that she had not expected to see at all. Cordelia rose from her seat near the back of the chamber, walking forward despite her father's visible fury at the sight of her doing so, and addressed the magistrate directly. "I did not intend to speak today," she said, her voice steady despite the tension evident in her posture. "But I find I cannot sit silently while my father's conduct is presented before this court as anything less than what it truly was. I witnessed his growing determination, in the weeks before his visit to Fernhollow Manor, to settle this matter by force if the courts did not rule in his favor swiftly enough. I warned the Duke and Miss Whitmore of his intentions myself, out of genuine concern for their safety, and I stand by that warning today, whatever it costs me with my own family." The chamber fell into a hushed murmur at her words, and Lord Grayson's face, Alara saw, had gone from red with fury to pale with the sudden, visible understanding that his own daughter's testimony had done more damage to his claim than anything Alaric's counsel might have said in the entire proceeding. The magistrate deliberated only briefly before returning with his ruling, his voice carrying clearly through the silent chamber. The succession of the Fernhollow title to Alaric was confirmed absolutely, and without further challenge, the physician's testimony accepted as sound and unimpeachable, and Lord Grayson's petition dismissed entirely, with a formal reprimand entered against his conduct during the armed visit to the manor weeks before, a mark that would follow his name in the county's legal record for a long while to come. Lord Grayson left the courthouse without a word to anyone, his face rigid with a defeat he could no longer dispute, and Alara watched him go with a strange mixture of relief and something almost like pity, thinking of Cordelia's brave testimony and the difficult road that likely lay ahead of her within her own family now. Cordelia herself lingered a moment longer, and Alara crossed the chamber to reach her before she could slip away. "Thank you," Alara said simply. "You did not have to speak today, knowing what it would cost you with your father. I will not forget it. Nor will I forget the kindness you showed me, the 2 times I came uninvited to your door," Cordelia said, managing a small, tired smile. "I do not know what awaits me now at home, but I find I do not regret the choice I made today, whatever comes of it." "You are always welcome at Fernhollow," Alaric said, joining them, his voice warm with genuine gratitude. "Whatever your father's feelings toward us now, our door remains open to you, for as long as you might need it." Cordelia's eyes glistened briefly at the offer before she composed herself, thanking them both properly before slipping away through the dispersing crowd, leaving Alara and Alaric standing together in the courthouse's emptying chamber, the long, difficult year of hidden truths and careful defenses finally, truly, behind them. They returned to Fernhollow Manor that evening to find the household gathered in the entrance hall, Mrs. Ashworth at their center, having clearly received word of the ruling well before the carriage arrived home. The old housekeeper's careful reserve broke entirely at the sight of them, tears standing openly in her eyes as she embraced Alara without hesitation, something she would never have dared during those first careful weeks of watchful silence. "It is finally over," she said, her voice thick with relief. "This house has waited a long while to simply be a home again, and I believe, watching the 2 of you now, that it has finally found its way there." That night, after the household's small, joyful celebration had wound down, and the manor had settled into its familiar quiet, Alaric found Alara once more in the small sitting room where they had first spoken honestly, so many weeks before, the same fire crackling in the same grate, the same chairs drawn close together near its warmth. "I believe," he said, settling into the chair across from her, "that I owe you a proper question now, rather than the careful half-promise I offered before the hearing was settled." Alara felt her heart lift at his words, watching him rise from his chair and cross the small distance between them, kneeling before her with an earnestness that erased, entirely, whatever remained of the frightened uncertainty she had carried into this house so many weeks before. "Alara Whitmore," he said, taking her hand in both of his, "you arrived at Fernhollow Manor believing yourself sent to a stranger the whole county feared, a bargain struck without your consent to settle debts that were never truly yours to pay. I cannot undo the fear that journey cost you, nor the deception, however unintentional at first, that greeted you upon your arrival. But I can promise you this. Whatever this house once was, whatever shadow of rumor and secrecy hung over it before you came, you have changed it entirely, simply by choosing, again and again, to stay and face its truths honestly beside me. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife, not as an arrangement forced upon either of us, but as a choice we make freely together, with nothing left hidden between us?" "Yes," Alara said, before he had even fully finished speaking, laughter and tears mixing together in her voice as she pulled him up and into an embrace that answered his question more completely than any single word could manage. "Yes, 1,000 times yes, Alaric. I would not trade a single frightening, difficult day of this past year for any other path my life might have taken instead." Word of their engagement spread through the county within days, and this time, Alara noted with quiet satisfaction. The story that traveled from house to house was not one of madness and hidden horror, but of a young duke who had fought honestly to protect his inheritance, and a young woman who had chosen, against every rumor that first greeted her, to see the truth for herself rather than fleeing from the shadow of a story that had never been true at all. They were married that autumn in the small village church where the rector who had once spoken so plainly on Alaric's behalf now presided over their vows. The manor's overgrown garden, cleared now and blooming properly for the first time in years, hosting the modest celebration that followed. Mrs. Ashworth wept openly through the entire ceremony, and Wilfred and his father stood proudly among the guests, having earned, through their quiet loyalty during the difficult months before, a place of genuine honor within the household they served. Cordelia attended as well, her relationship with her own father strained but not entirely broken, choosing at last to build her own life at some careful distance from his ambitions. A friendship with Alara and Alaric growing steadily in the months that followed their difficult first meetings. Alara's father attended the wedding as well, arriving several days early with an apology he had clearly rehearsed many times over the long journey north. He found her in the garden the morning before the ceremony, and stood for a long moment before he could bring himself to speak properly. "I sent you here believing I was condemning you to misery," he admitted, his voice rough with an emotion she had rarely heard from him. "I told myself it was necessity, that our family's debts left me no other choice, and perhaps that much was true. But I did not think, not once, to wonder what kind of life I was truly sending you toward, or to question the rumors closely enough before I signed away your future to them." "You could not have known the truth of it," Alara said gently, surprising herself with how easily forgiveness came, now that she stood on the other side of everything that fear had once threatened. "None of us could have. I do not think even Alaric himself fully understood, when this arrangement was first made, how it would all unfold." "I am proud of you nonetheless," her father said, "for finding your own way through a situation I handed you so carelessly. Whatever debt this marriage settles for our family, I find I care a great deal less about it now than I do about the happiness I see plainly in your face, standing here in this garden. That is worth more to me than any sum of money ever could be, and I am sorry it took me so long, and so much risk to you, to understand that properly." They embraced, something healing settling between them that had been strained since the day his letter first arrived demanding her obedience without explanation. And Alara found that she could finally set down the last small weight of resentment she had carried since that frightened first night at Fernhollow Manor, understanding at last that her father's failing had come from desperation rather than cruelty, and that both could be forgiven in time. The wedding day itself dawned clear and bright, a rare gift after so many gray, storm-swept months, and Alara stood before the small village church feeling none of the fear that had once ridden with her through that first terrible storm toward this same county. The garden path leading to the manor had been cleared entirely now, lined with the first blooms of the season, and as she walked it on her father's arm toward the waiting church, she found herself thinking, briefly, of the frightened girl who had first arrived at Fernhollow's gates believing herself sent to a madman's chamber. That girl could not have imagined this morning, could not have guessed that the tall, quick figure glimpsed in the storm-swept garden that first terrifying night would become the steady, gentle man now waiting for her at the altar, his eyes bright with a happiness that matched her own entirely. The ceremony itself passed in a warm blur, vows spoken plainly and honestly, without any of the careful secrecy that had once governed every word exchanged within Fernhollow's walls. And when at last the rector pronounced them properly married, the small gathered crowd of household staff, village neighbors, and Alara's own relieved family broke into applause that echoed warmly against the old stone church. The celebration that followed in the manor's reclaimed garden stretched long into the evening, lanterns strung between the newly pruned hedges, tables laden with food the cook had spent days preparing with visible pride, and music provided by a small group of village musicians who played long past dark, while the newly married couple danced together beneath a sky finally clear of the storms that had once seemed to follow Alara everywhere she traveled in this county. Late that night, once the last guests had finally departed and the household had retired, exhausted and content, Alara stood with Alaric at the same window in her old chamber, where she had first glimpsed his quick, mysterious figure moving through the storm-darkened garden below. The garden looked entirely different now, cleared and blooming, moonlight falling gently over paths that had once seemed tangled with secrets and danger alike. "Do you remember?" she asked softly, leaning against him as his arms came around her. "That very first night, when I saw you from this window and could not make sense of what I had seen." "I remember," Alaric said, resting his chin lightly against her hair. "I nearly did not walk that path at all that night. I told myself I only wished to check that the new arrangements for your arrival had been properly seen to. I think, if I am honest, I simply could not stay away even then, though I did not yet understand why." "I am glad you did not stay away," Alara said. "Whatever fear that first night carried, I would not trade it for any other beginning, knowing now where it has led us both." They stood together a while longer at the window, watching the moonlight settle gently over the garden that had once seemed so full of shadow and secret. And Alara felt, at last, entirely and completely at home within the walls that had once frightened her so deeply. Fernhollow Manor, once whispered about through the county as a house of madness and shadow, stood now as it always should have, a home built honestly on truth freely chosen, its gardens blooming, its halls filled with light, and its once-feared name spoken, at last, with nothing but respect. And so the story that had once traveled through the county as a warning, sent to the Duke of Fernhollow, rumored old and mad, unaware who would enter her chamber, became instead a different kind of story entirely, one told now with warmth rather than fear. A story of a young woman who arrived at a stranger's door expecting the worst the world had to offer, and found instead, hidden beneath layers of careful secrecy and desperate necessity, a man worth every risk she had taken to know him properly. A year passed at Fernhollow Manor, and with it came changes so gradual that Alara sometimes found herself pausing in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, struck suddenly by how completely the house had transformed since that first stormy night when she had arrived believing herself sent to a stranger's mercy. The garden that had once been choked with dead vines now bloomed properly through every season, tended jointly by Alaric, Wilfred, and his father, who had been given, at Alaric's insistence, a proper cottage on the grounds and a title befitting his years of quiet, loyal service. The dust-covered portraits in the long gallery had been cleaned and rehung, their forgotten faces restored to the light, and the great dining hall, once shrouded and silent, now hosted regular gatherings of neighbors and friends who would once never have dreamed of accepting an invitation to Fernhollow Manor. Mrs. Ashworth remained at the heart of the household, her careful reserve softened permanently now into something warmer, though she still kept the same watchful eye over every detail of the house's running that she always had. It was she who came to Alara one bright spring morning, nearly a year after the wedding, with news that sent the household into a fresh flurry of joyful preparation. "A letter has arrived from Cordelia," Mrs. Ashworth said, finding Alara in the small sitting room where she now spent many of her mornings, the same room where Alaric had once left a book of poetry open on its side table, the very first small clue that had begun unraveling the truth of this house so many months before. She writes that she intends to visit next month, and that she brings good news of her own to share. Cordelia had, in the months since the hearing, built a careful new life for herself at some distance from her father's household, her relationship with Lord Grayson remaining strained but no longer openly hostile, softened slowly by time and by his own quiet recognition, never spoken aloud but evident in small gestures, that his daughter's courage that day in the courthouse had likely spared him from a far graver ruin than the one his ambitions had already cost him. Cordelia visited Fernhollow often now, her friendship with Alara having grown, exactly as both women had once hoped it might, into something steady and true. When she arrived the following month, stepping down from her own carriage with none of the wary caution that had marked her first 2 visits, she brought with her a young gentleman Alara did not recognize, introduced simply as Edward, a quiet, kind-faced man Cordelia had met through mutual friends in the months since the hearing, and whose company had brought a lightness to her expression that Alara had never seen there before. "We are to be married in the autumn," Cordelia announced, once the initial greetings had been exchanged, and the small party had settled into the garden for tea beneath the newly flowering trees. "My father has given his blessing, somewhat reluctantly, though I believe he has grown weary enough of disappointment these past months that he finds himself grateful simply to see me happy, whatever path led me there." "I am so glad for you," Alara said, embracing her friend warmly. "After everything you risked to help us, you deserve every happiness that has found you since." The afternoon passed warmly, filled with easy conversation and laughter that would have seemed impossible in the tense, secretive early days of Alara's arrival at Fernhollow. Alaric joined them once his morning's work with the estate accounts had concluded, greeting Cordelia and her, intended with the genuine warmth of a man who no longer needed to guard every word spoken within his own walls, and the small gathering stretched pleasantly into evening, lanterns lit among the garden's blooming hedges, as the household's small staff moved easily about their familiar duties, no longer burdened by the careful secrecy that had once governed every hour of the house's operation. It was later that evening, after Cordelia and Edward had retired to the chambers prepared for their stay, and the rest of the household had settled into its quiet nighttime rhythm, that Alara found Alaric once more in the small sitting room, seated in his usual chair near the fire, a new book open on his lap rather than the old volume of poetry that had once so puzzled her. "You are smiling," he observed, looking up as she entered and settled into the chair across from him, close enough now that their hands found each other easily, without the hesitant uncertainty of those earlier days. "I am thinking of how much has changed," Alara said, "since that first frightening night when I arrived here, certain I had been sent to face some terrible, mad stranger. I could never have imagined, sitting frozen in that carriage during the storm, that I would find myself here a year later, watching my dearest friend announce her own engagement in a garden that once seemed so full of shadow and danger." "Nor could I have imagined," Alaric said, setting his book aside entirely, "that the frightened young woman I first spoke to in the gallery, standing before my own portrait with such open suspicion in her eyes, would become the very heart of this house, and of my own life within so short a time." He reached across the small distance between them and drew her hand to his lips, a gesture that had grown natural between them now, easy and unhesitant. "I have thought often, this past year, of how differently everything might have turned out, had you chosen fear over curiosity that first night, had you accepted the rumors as truth and fled this house before ever giving either of us the chance to prove them wrong." "I very nearly did fear you," Alara admitted, smiling at the memory now that it held no power to trouble her. "That first glimpse of you in the garden, moving so quickly through the mist, I confess my heart nearly stopped with fright." "And yet you stayed at the window rather than hiding beneath your blankets," Alaric said, laughter warming his voice. "I have always suspected that small choice, watching rather than fleeing, said a great deal about the woman you would prove to be, long before either of us understood the truth we were both keeping from the other." They sat together a while longer in comfortable silence, the fire burning low, the house settling into its peaceful nighttime quiet around them, a quiet that no longer carried any weight of hidden fear or careful secrecy, only the simple, steady comfort of a home properly built and properly loved. Somewhere above them, in chambers once locked each night against dangers real and imagined, Cordelia and Edward slept soundly, guests welcomed openly rather than hidden away in careful shadow. Somewhere below, in the kitchens where Mrs. Ashworth had once guarded every word spoken about the household's true master, the staff moved through their evening duties with the easy confidence of people who no longer feared what the coming morning might bring. And in the garden beyond the windows, where a frightened young woman had once glimpsed a mysterious stranger moving through the storm and mist, the same paths now lay quiet and peaceful beneath a clear night sky, tended lovingly by the very man whose figure had once seemed so full of danger, and walked now, each evening, by the two of them together, hand in hand, with nothing left between them but the simple, steady truth of a love that had grown, against every fearful rumor the county had ever whispered, into something neither of them would ever again have reason to doubt. The estate itself had flourished alongside its master and mistress. Tenants who had once spoken of Fernhollow only in fearful whispers now found their rents fair, and their grievances heard promptly. Alaric having spent his newly secured position not on comfort alone, but on the slow, careful work of setting right what a year of uncertainty and his uncle's long decline had allowed to fall into neglect. Fields once left fallow through lack of proper oversight now yielded steady harvests, and the small village nearest the manor had grown livelier with trade, its shopkeepers no longer wary of a house they once believed cursed by madness, but grateful instead for the steady custom and fair dealing that came from its gates. Alara had taken to riding out among the tenant farms herself most weeks, a practice that startled the older residents at first, unaccustomed to any lady of the manor taking such direct interest in their daily concerns, but one they came quickly to welcome, finding in her a willing ear for troubles that might otherwise have gone unheard until they grew too large to easily mend. She had learned, in her own way, the same lesson the garden had once taught Alaric, that honest attention paid consistently, and without pretense did more to earn trust than any grand gesture offered only occasionally. Word of the transformation at Fernhollow had traveled well beyond the county's borders by the time Cordelia and Edward's own wedding took place that autumn, a celebration nearly as joyful as Alara and Alaric's own had been, held this time in the gardens of Cordelia's family estate, with Lord Grayson himself, subdued but present, walking his daughter down the aisle with what appeared, to those who knew to look for it, like genuine pride beneath his still-guarded composure. Alara stood among the gathered guests that day, Alaric's hand steady in her own, and found herself marveling at how thoroughly a single frightened carriage ride through a storm, so many months before, had led eventually to this warm autumn afternoon, surrounded by friends she could never have imagined making, in a life she could never have imagined choosing for herself. That winter, as the first snow settled softly over Fernhollow's gardens, Mrs. Ashworth brought news to the small sitting room one quiet evening that filled the house with a fresh kind of joy entirely its own. Alara was to have a child by summer, and the household, upon learning the news, seemed almost to hold its collective breath with happiness, Mrs. Ashworth dabbing at her eyes with the same handkerchief she had used at their wedding, Wilfred grinning so widely his father had to remind him twice to mind his work in the garden, rather than standing about announcing the news to every passing bird. Alaric, when Alara told him privately that same evening, said nothing at first, only rose from his chair and crossed to where she sat, kneeling before her exactly as he had the night he first properly asked for her hand, and pressed his forehead gently against hers in a silence that spoke more warmly than any words he might have chosen. "This house has waited a long while," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion he did not try to hide, "for a reason to hope so fully again. I find I can hardly believe it has finally found one. It found its reason to hope the day I chose to stay, rather than flee," Alara said softly, "and it will only grow stronger now, with a child to fill these halls with laughter rather than the old fearful silence that once ruled them." The snow continued to fall gently outside the tall windows as they sat together that evening, the fire warm between them, the house settling into its quiet winter rhythm around a family that had grown, slowly and honestly, from the ashes of fear and rumor into something neither of them could have imagined finding. On that first stormy night, when a frightened young woman arrived at a stranger's gate, sent to a duke rumored old and mad, never once suspecting the truth of who would enter her chamber, nor the life that truth would one day lead her toward.